In the autumn of 1823, deep within the thick woodlands of southeastern Ohio, a young woman was discovered wandering naked through the forest, her skin marked with geometric scars that defied all medical understanding. Margaret Hayes, barely 22 years old, had vanished for over 3 months. When local hunters found her, she was muttering in broken phrases about the sessions and the chair with leather straps. 3 separate physicians, all esteemed men in their communities, examined her and subsequently refused to continue her treatment. The official documents were sealed by the county magistrate and buried in archives that would remain hidden for almost 200 years. What those doctors uncovered about Margaret's state was so deeply unsettling that one of them, Dr. Edmund Cartwright, allegedly burned his clinical notes and departed from Ohio for good. Tonight, we will unearth the truth behind Margaret's case, a story that exposes the most shadowy recesses of early American medicine and the cost of scientific ambition when it is severed from human compassion. Before we proceed with the account of Margaret Hayes and the horrifying revelations that compelled 3 doctors to turn from their sworn duty, I must ask you to click that subscribe button if you have the courage to hear stories most would prefer remained buried. These are not mere tales. They are pieces of genuine history that influential figures attempted to wipe from the record. Leave a comment below telling me which state you're joining us from, and let's create a community of those who pursue the truth, no matter how dark it may be. The reality of Margaret's ordeal begins in the summer of 1823. When she first disappeared from her small farming settlement near what is now Athens County, Ohio. The Ohio frontier in 1823 was a severe environment where survival often overshadowed comfort, and the boundary between civilization and the wild remained perilously blurred. Margaret Hayes resided with her widowed father, Thomas Hayes, on a humble farm roughly 12 miles south of Athens, in a hamlet locals referred to as Millfield. The community comprised perhaps 40 families, most of them newcomers from Pennsylvania and Virginia, who had sought affordable land and a new beginning in the Ohio Territory. Margaret was known throughout the settlement as a young woman of unusual intellect. She could read and write with a fluency that was rare among frontier women of her day. Her father, a former schoolteacher turned farmer, had educated her well, beyond what was typically deemed suitable for a woman of her standing. She maintained detailed diaries about farm life, read medical texts borrowed from the town's doctor, and corresponded with relatives back in Pennsylvania through letters that revealed a sharp mind and inquisitive nature. The Hayes family inhabited a log cabin Thomas had constructed himself, surrounded by cleared fields where they cultivated corn, wheat, and vegetables. Their closest neighbor was the Brennan family, Irish immigrants who had arrived just 2 years prior, living nearly a mile away. This isolation was characteristic of frontier existence, but it also meant that when trouble arose, assistance was distant and frequently arrived too late. Dr. Samuel Hart-well was the settlement's sole physician, a man in his 50s who had trained in Philadelphia before relocating west in 1819. He was known for his meticulous medical approach and his practice of keeping thorough records for every patient he treated. Dr. Hart-well had examined Margaret on several occasions over the years for minor ailments, a fractured wrist at 16, a serious fever the following winter, and routine checkups that confirmed what was already evident. She was healthy, intelligent, and remarkably resilient. The summer of 1823 had been especially challenging for the Hayes family. Thomas had injured his back during the spring planting, leaving much of the farm labor to Margaret. She had handled it capably, but neighbors observed that she appeared increasingly withdrawn and fatigued. Mary Brennan, the Irish woman who lived nearest to the Hayes farm, later informed investigators that Margaret had ceased her visits in late June, which was unusual given the friendship the 2 women had formed despite their different origins. What made Margaret's vanishing especially alarming was its suddenness. On the morning of July 15th, 1823, Thomas Hayes awoke to find his daughter's bed empty and her few personal possessions, including her cherished journals, gone. There were no indications of a struggle inside the cabin, no proof of forced entry, and no letter explaining her departure. Her father promptly organized a search party, but despite scouring the surrounding woods for days, they found no sign of Margaret Hayes. The search efforts were hindered by the dense woodland encircling the settlement. The Ohio forest of 1823 was still largely primordial, a thick canopy of oak, maple, and hickory trees creating a perpetual twilight beneath their boughs. Wild animals were plentiful, including wolves and bears, and it was easy for a person to become disoriented in the seemingly endless labyrinth of trees, creeks, and gullies. As weeks turned into months with no trace of Margaret, the settlement began to murmur about her fate. Some thought she had fallen prey to wild animals. Others suspected kidnapping by Native Americans, though no tribes had been sighted in the area for over a year. A few proposed she had simply fled, perhaps to wed a young man from a neighboring settlement. But this theory was dismissed by those who knew her well. Margaret had displayed no interest in suitors and had often voiced her satisfaction with her life in Millfield. The morning of October 23rd, 1823, broke cold and grey, with an autumn haze that seemed to deaden sound and soften the edges of the world. Two local hunters, James Fletcher and his teenage son Robert, were tracking deer through the woods approximately 8 miles northeast of Millfield when they heard what they first took for an animal in distress. The noise was a low, rhythmic moaning emanating from deeper within the forest. As they drew nearer, the moaning clarified into something more disquieting. A human voice, but speaking in a cadence that didn't fully cohere. Words and phrases repeated again and again, separated by lengthy silences, then sudden eruptions of what sounded like frantic begging. The Fletchers exchanged concerned looks. In 3 decades of hunting these woods, James had never heard anything like it. They discovered her in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from Miller's Creek, a stream that eventually fed into the Hocking River. Margaret Hayes was seated cross-legged on the ground, entirely naked, her long dark hair hanging in knotted clumps around her shoulders. She was rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped around her knees, and she was speaking in a voice that was recognizably hers, yet somehow altered, flatter, more mechanical. "The sessions must continue," she repeated incessantly. "The chair with leather straps. The observations are incomplete. The subject requires additional stimulus." Then she would fall quiet for perhaps half a minute before starting again with slight variations. "The sessions must continue. The measurements are not yet precise. The subject shows promising reactions to the copper instruments." James Fletcher, a War of 1812 veteran not easily unnerved, later told Dr. Hart-well that the sight of Margaret Hayes was the most disturbing spectacle he had ever witnessed. It wasn't merely her nudity or her apparent insanity. It was the state of her body. Even from several feet away, he could see her skin was covered in what looked like scars, but scars unlike any he had encountered before. They formed geometric patterns across her arms, legs, and torso, precise lines and angles that resembled mathematical diagrams etched into human flesh. When Robert Fletcher tried to approach her, Margaret's head jerked up with alarming swiftness. Her eyes, once bright with intelligence, were now unfocused and strange, as if she were seeing something far beyond the forest clearing. She began speaking more rapidly, her voice climbing in pitch. "The doctor requires compliance. The measurements must be exact. The subject will remain still during the procedure. The copper instruments must be heated to the proper temperature." The hunters wrapped her in James's hunting coat and carried her back to the settlement, where Dr. Hart-well was summoned at once. What he found when he examined Margaret Hayes in the privacy of his modest clinic would contest everything he believed he knew about medicine, human nature, and the boundaries of scientific pursuit. Dr. Samuel Hart-well, had practiced medicine for over 20 years, first in Philadelphia and then on the Ohio frontier. He had treated battlefield injuries, delivered babies in frontier cabins, and diagnosed illnesses that had no names in the medical texts of his era. But nothing in his background had prepared him for the methodical horror he encountered when he examined Margaret Hayes. The geometric scars covering her body were not random mutilations or the result of some mishap. They were precise, intentional incisions made with surgical tools. Each cut was exactly the same depth, about 1/8 of an inch, and they formed patterns that seemed to align with anatomical landmarks. Lines radiated from specific points on her shoulders, arms, and legs, creating what appeared to be a map of her muscular and nervous systems. Dr. Hart-well's initial inspection revealed 17 distinct scar patterns, each consisting of multiple incisions made at different times. The precision was extraordinary. Whoever had done this possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy and significant skill with surgical instruments. The scars had healed cleanly, suggesting proper medical care had been administered during the recovery process. But it was Margaret's behavior that truly unsettled the physician. She would sit motionless for extended periods, her eyes empty and fixed, then abruptly begin speaking in that same mechanical voice the hunters had heard. She would describe procedures in clinical detail, referring to herself in the third person as the subject and speaking of various measurements and observations conducted on her body. The subject's response to electrical stimulus was recorded on day 47, she would say, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. The copper probes inserted at precise locations along the spinal column. The subject's verbal responses indicate heightened sensitivity in the lower lumbar region. The doctor was pleased with the results and authorized continuation of the experiment. Dr. Hart-well attempted various treatments, laudanum to calm her, gentle questioning to ascertain what had happened, even efforts to hypnotize her using methods he had learned in Philadelphia. Nothing seemed to penetrate whatever barrier stood between Margaret's awareness and the external world. She would answer direct questions about her basic needs: food, water, warmth, but any inquiry regarding her experiences during the 3 months she was missing would trigger another recitation of clinical observations. The most distressing aspect of her condition was the way she would sometimes address him as doctor and seem to anticipate him continuing whatever had been done to her. She would arrange herself in specific postures, lying on her side with arms outstretched or sitting upright with her head tilted at particular angles, and wait expectantly for him to act. When he failed to respond as she apparently anticipated, she would grow agitated and start repeating phrases about protocol and the necessity of continuing the work. After 3 days of examination, Dr. Hart-well reached a conclusion that shook him to his core. Margaret Hayes had been subjected to systematic medical experimentation by someone with considerable knowledge and skill. The scars, her demeanor, and the clinical terminology she employed all indicated a sustained period of abuse masquerading as scientific inquiry. But who could have performed such acts? And why had Margaret seemingly cooperated with procedures that must have inflicted tremendous pain and psychological harm? The answers to these questions would prove more horrifying than Dr. Hart-well could have conceived, and would ultimately pressure him into a decision that would torment him for the remainder of his days. Dr. Hart-well's inquiry into Margaret's condition commenced with a careful inspection of her belongings, which had been located scattered throughout the forest near where she was found. Her journal, missing since her disappearance, was discovered wedged between 2 fallen logs about 50 yards from the clearing. The leather cover was water-damaged and many pages were illegible, but sufficient text remained to offer troubling glimpses into her final weeks before vanishing. The early entries were characteristic of Margaret's writing: detailed observations about farm life, weather patterns, and her correspondence with Pennsylvania relatives. But starting in late June, her penmanship began to change. The typically neat script grew increasingly erratic, with words crossed out and rewritten multiple times. The content also shifted, focusing obsessively on medical topics and scientific procedures. June 28, 1823. Dr. Hart-well's medical texts describe the use of electrical apparatus in treating nervous disorders. The principle seems sound. If electricity can animate a frog's legs, as demonstrated by the Italian physician Galvani, surely it might restore proper function to damaged nerves in living subjects. I've been reading about the experiments conducted in Philadelphia and Boston. The results are most promising. July 1st, 1823. I have been invited to observe advanced medical procedures. The opportunity to witness true scientific inquiry is rare in a place like Millfield. I have been assured that my education and intelligence make me suitable for participation in important research. Father need not know of these visits. He would not understand the significance of the work being conducted. The final legible entry was dated July 12th, just 3 days before her disappearance. The preliminary examinations are complete. I have been selected as ideal for the advanced procedures. The doctor explains that pain is temporary, but scientific knowledge is eternal. I understand the importance of the work and give my consent freely. The sessions will begin tomorrow. Dr. Hart-well studied these entries with mounting dread. Margaret's references to the doctor and advanced procedures clearly indicated she had been in contact with another physician. Someone who had persuaded her to take part in what she believed was legitimate medical research. But who was this mysterious doctor and where had these sessions occurred? The answer emerged from an unexpected source. While inspecting Margaret's clothing, found in various spots throughout the forest, Dr. Hart-well discovered a small piece of paper sewn into the lining of her dress. It was a fragment of a letter written in an unfamiliar hand, containing partial instructions for some type of medical procedure. Subject must be secured using the leather restraints to prevent movement during the application of electrical current. The copper probes should be inserted at depths of no more than 1/4 inch to avoid permanent damage to the nervous system. Duration of each session should not exceed 30 minutes, and the subject must be given adequate time to recover between applications. The clinical detachment of the language was chilling, but what disturbed Dr. Hart-well most was the paper itself. It was high-quality writing paper, the sort used by affluent professionals, not the coarse material typically available on the frontier. The ink was also superior, suggesting the author had access to expensive supplies and likely significant financial resources. Dr. Hart-well began making discreet inquiries throughout the region. Had anyone spotted Margaret during the month she was missing? Had any itinerant physicians visited the area? Were there reports of unusual activities or strangers nearby? The responses were largely negative, but one piece of information proved significant. Samuel Brennan, the Irish immigrant living closest to the Hayes farm, mentioned he had seen lights at the old Westfield property during the summer months. The Westfield place was an abandoned farmstead about 5 miles north of Millfield, left vacant after the original owner died of fever in 1821. The property included a substantial log house and several outbuildings, all slowly decaying for 2 years. I thought it might be squatters, Brennan explained, but the lights were too regular, always in the same window of the main house and always at the same time of night, around 10 o'clock. It went on for weeks, maybe 2 months. Then it stopped suddenly, sometime in early October. Dr. Hart-well resolved to investigate the Westfield property himself, despite the growing apprehension that had been building since Margaret's return. What he found there would confirm his gravest fears and compel him to face the possibility that someone within their small community was capable of monstrous acts in the name of science. The Westfield property sat in a natural hollow surrounded by hills, invisible from the main road and reachable only by a narrow path winding through dense woodland. As Dr. Hart-well approached the abandoned farmstead on the morning of October 30th, 1823, he was struck by its profound isolation. Someone could conduct any manner of activity here without fear of discovery by chance observers. The main house was a large log structure built with greater care and expense than most frontier homes. The original owner, Jonathan Westfield, had been a prosperous merchant who invested heavily in land speculation before his premature death. The house featured glass windows, a luxury in frontier Ohio, and a stone chimney suggesting the owner had intended to live comfortably, Dr. Hart-well said. First clue the property had been recently occupied came when he noticed the front door, which should have been secured with a wooden bar, was slightly ajar. The hinges had been recently oiled, and the door opened silently when he pushed it. Inside, the main room showed clear signs of recent habitation. The wooden floors had been swept clean, and a faint odor of lamp oil hung in the air, but it was his discovery in the back room that made his blood run cold. The space had been converted into what could only be described as a primitive medical laboratory. A large wooden table dominated the room's center, its surface stained dark with what appeared to be blood. Leather restraints were fastened to the table at intervals corresponding to a human form: wrists, ankles, waist, and neck. The restraints showed signs of heavy use, with wear patterns indicating they had secured someone who struggled against them. Along the walls, Dr. Hart-well found an array of medical instruments that were both familiar and horrifying. There were surgical knives of various sizes, all clean and well-maintained, a set of copper probes connected by wires, to what seemed to be a primitive electrical apparatus, powered by a series of glass jars filled with metal plates, a voltaic pile similar to those used in electrical experiments at major universities. Most disturbing of all was a collection of detailed drawings pinned to the wall above the table. They were anatomical sketches of a female form, marked with precise measurements and notations. The drawings matched exactly the scar patterns Dr. Hart-well had observed on Margaret's body. Every incision had been planned and documented with scientific exactness. A leather-bound journal lay open on a smaller table near the window. Dr. Hart-well opened it with trembling hands and found page after page of clinical observations written in the same hand he had seen on the paper fragment in Margaret's dress. The dated entries described a series of experiments conducted on Subject M over nearly 3 months. Day 1. Subject M has been prepared for the initial procedure. Baseline measurements taken. Subject shows excellent physical condition and high intelligence, making her ideal for the planned experiments. Initial incisions made along the predetermined anatomical landmarks. Subject remained conscious throughout the procedure as planned. Reactions recorded. Day 15. Electrical stimulation experiments commenced. Subject M's responses to varying degrees of current applied to different nerve clusters. The copper probes proved most effective when heated to approximately 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Subject's verbal responses indicate precise locations of maximum sensitivity. Day 32. Subject M has begun to show signs of psychological adaptation to the procedures. She no longer resists the restraints and has begun to assist in positioning herself for each session. This cooperation will allow for more precise measurements and extended experimental periods. Dr. Hart-well found himself unable to continue reading. The clinical detachment with which these horrors were recorded was almost as appalling as the procedures themselves. But one detail in the journal entry seized his attention. The handwriting was not merely familiar in style, it seemed to match writing he had seen before. As he scrutinized the journal more carefully, comparing it to medical notes in his own bag, a dreadful realization took shape. The handwriting, the medical terminology, the sophisticated grasp of anatomy and experimental method, all of it pointed to someone with extensive medical training, someone with access to advanced equipment and supplies. The truth struck him with physical force. He recognized this handwriting because he had seen it many times before in medical correspondence and professional journals. The person who had performed these experiments on Margaret Hayes was Dr. Elias Cunningham, the most revered physician in southeastern Ohio, a man trained at Harvard Medical School who had been researching nervous system disorders for over a decade. Just when we believed we had grasped the full horror of Margaret's case, the situation intensifies. If this story is unsettling you, share this video with a friend who appreciates dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's uncover together what happens next in this investigation that would rattle the foundations of medical ethics in frontier America. Dr. Elias Cunningham lived in Athens, the county seat, in a substantial brick house that served as both his residence and his practice. He was 58 years old, a Harvard-trained physician who had moved to Ohio in 1815 with the stated aim of advancing medical knowledge through research into nervous system disorders. His reputation was unimpeachable. He had treated governors, judges, and wealthy merchants throughout the region, and his medical opinions were sought by doctors as far away as Cincinnati and Columbus. Dr. Hart-well's journey to Athens on November 2nd, 1823, was the most arduous of his life. He carried Margaret's journal, the clinical notes from the Westfield property, and a mounting certainty that he was about to confront one of the most horrific betrayals of medical ethics in American history. But he also carried haunting questions. How had Cunningham convinced Margaret to participate? How had he accessed the Westfield property? And most crucially, were there other victims? The brick house stood on Main Street, its facade projecting an image of respectable prosperity. Heavy curtains hung in the windows, and a brass nameplate beside the door read, Dr. E. Cunningham, M.D., Harvard Medical College. Dr. Hart-well had visited this house numerous times for professional consultations, but today he felt he was entering the domain of a stranger, or worse, a monster disguised as a healer. Cunningham received him in his private study, a room Dr. Hart-well had always admired for its impressive collection of medical texts and anatomical specimens. Now viewing the glass jars containing preserved organs and the detailed anatomical charts on the walls, he wondered how many of these specimens had originated from Cunningham's research subjects. When Dr. Hart-well placed the journal and clinical notes on Cunningham's mahogany desk, the older physician's reaction was telling. There was no surprise, no shock, no outrage at the accusations. Instead, Cunningham's pale blue eyes examined the evidence with the same clinical detachment he might show when studying an interesting medical specimen. I wondered when someone would discover the Westfield facility, Cunningham said calmly, leaning back in his leather chair. I had hoped to complete my current series of experiments before relocating to a more secure location. The casual admission struck Dr. Hart-well like a physical blow. Current series? Dear God, Cunningham, are you saying there are others? Cunningham reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a leather portfolio, opening it to reveal a series of detailed sketches. Each drawing depicted a different person, men and women of various ages, with the same precise anatomical markings Dr. Hart-well had seen on Margaret's body. Names were inscribed beneath each sketch. Subject A, James Patterson, age 24. Subject C, Sarah Mills, age 19. Subject F, Thomas Burke, age 31. You cannot possibly understand the significance of what I've accomplished, Cunningham said, his voice carrying the tone of a professor addressing a particularly slow student. For centuries, medical science has been hampered by ethical constraints that prevent us from conducting the kind of research necessary to advance human knowledge. I have broken through those barriers. Dr. Hart-well stared at the portfolio in horror. These are people, Cunningham. Human beings with families, with lives, with futures that you destroyed in the name of your research. Subjects, Cunningham corrected firmly. Carefully selected subjects who contributed to the advancement of medical science. Their sacrifice will benefit thousands of future patients who will receive treatment based on the knowledge gained through my research. Dr. Hart-well demanded to know how Cunningham had persuaded Margaret to participate in such horrors. The answer revealed a manipulation so calculated and cruel it seemed to defy human comprehension. Cunningham explained he had developed a systematic method for identifying and recruiting subjects. He would travel throughout the remote settlements of southeastern Ohio, ostensibly providing medical care to underserved communities, but actually pinpointing potential subjects, young people who were intelligent, physically healthy, and most importantly, socially isolated. Margaret Hayes was ideal, Cunningham said, pulling out a separate file containing detailed notes about her background. Highly intelligent, curious about medical science, living with only her father in a remote location. I began cultivating her interest during my visits to treat her father's injury. I brought her medical texts to read, discussed cases with her, praised her understanding of complex concepts. She was hungry for intellectual stimulation and grateful for my attention. The seduction had been gradual and psychologically sophisticated. Cunningham had convinced Margaret she was uniquely qualified to assist in groundbreaking medical research. He had shown her letters supposedly from prominent physicians in Boston and Philadelphia, praising his work and stressing the importance of finding suitable research assistants. He had even forged endorsements from medical institutions, creating an entire fictional network of support for his experiments. I told her that the research required absolute secrecy because of the conservative attitudes of frontier communities toward advanced medical procedures, Cunningham continued. She believed she was participating in work that would eventually be published in the most prestigious medical journals in America. She was proud to be selected for such important research. Dr. Hart-well felt ill as he grasped the full extent of Cunningham's manipulation. And the others? How many others have there been? Cunningham consulted a separate journal, tracing his finger down a list of names and dates. Margaret was subject G, the 7th in my current research series. The previous subjects provided valuable data, but they lacked her intelligence and resilience. Most expired during the more advanced procedures before I could complete the full experimental protocol. The casual manner in which Cunningham discussed the deaths of 6 human beings was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire conversation. He displayed no remorse, no acknowledgement that he had committed any wrong. In his mind, he was a pioneering researcher who had simply possessed the courage to push beyond conventional ethical boundaries. Where are they buried? Dr. Hart-well asked, his voice barely a whisper. Disposed of in remote locations where they will never be discovered, Cunningham replied. The forest is vast and there are many deep ravines and abandoned mine shafts in this region. Their remains serve no further purpose for my research. Dr. Hart-well stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Your research ends now, Cunningham. I have documented evidence of your crimes, and I intend to present it to the State Attorney General. You will face justice for what you have done. Cunningham's reaction was swift and decisive. His demeanor shifted instantly from clinical detachment to cold menace. You will do nothing, he said, rising from his chair and moving to a cabinet containing his medical instruments. I have spent too many years developing this research to allow a frontier physician with limited understanding to destroy it. I have influential friends throughout this region, Cunningham continued, withdrawing a surgical knife from the cabinet. Judges, prosecutors, wealthy merchants who depend on my medical expertise. Who do you think will be believed? A respected Harvard-trained physician conducting important research? Or a country doctor making wild accusations based on the ravings of a mentally disturbed woman? Cunningham advanced toward Dr. Hart-well, the surgical knife held with the practiced grip of someone who had used such instruments many times before. Margaret Hayes was found wandering in the forest, clearly insane. Any scars on her body can be explained as self-inflicted wounds caused by her mental condition. There is no credible evidence of any crime, and there never will be. But Dr. Hart-well had anticipated this possibility. Before coming to Athens, he had prepared for the likelihood that Cunningham would attempt to silence him. Hidden in various locations around Millfield were copies of the evidence he had gathered, along with detailed letters describing his discoveries. If he failed to return by a specified date, those documents would be delivered to authorities in Columbus. I've prepared for this conversation. Cunningham, Dr. Hart-well said, backing toward the door while keeping his eyes on the knife. If anything happens to me, multiple copies of your research notes and journal entries will be delivered to the governor, the state attorney general, and several newspaper editors. Your crimes will be exposed regardless of your connections. Cunningham paused, his expression shifting as he calculated the implications of this revelation. For the first time during their conversation, Dr. Hart-well saw uncertainty in the man's eyes. You're bluffing, Cunningham said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Dr. Hart-well replied. Are you willing to stake your reputation and your freedom on that assumption? The confrontation reached its climax when Cunningham, apparently deciding he had no choice but to eliminate the threat, lunged forward with the surgical knife. Dr. Hart-well had served briefly as a military surgeon during the War of 1812, and his reflexes, though dulled by age, were still sharp enough to evade the initial thrust. In the decades following Margaret's case, Dr. Hart-well became increasingly reclusive and eventually ceased practicing medicine altogether. He sold his remaining medical equipment in 1830 and devoted himself to farming and tending the few animals on his small property. Neighbors described him as a sad but kind man who would provide medical care in emergencies, but who seemed haunted by some unspoken tragedy. The story of Margaret Hayes and Dr. Cunningham's crimes remained buried for nearly 2 centuries. The official records were sealed by court order, and the few people who knew the truth carried their knowledge to their graves. It was only in the 1990s, when Athens County Courthouse records were being digitized, that a researcher discovered the anomalous file containing Dr. Hart-well's sealed report about unusual medical circumstances requiring confidential handling. The discovery prompted a limited investigation that uncovered fragments of the story, enough to assemble the basic facts, but insufficient to provide complete answers about the scope of Cunningham's crimes or the fate of his other victims. Archaeological surveys of the Westfield property and surrounding areas have never located any human remains, suggesting Cunningham was thorough in disposing of evidence. Margaret Hayes lived until 1847, dying peacefully at age 46 in the Quaker household that had cared for her for over 20 years. Her death was recorded simply as natural causes following a long illness, with no mention of the trauma that had shaped her adult life. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Philadelphia, her gravestone bearing only her name and dates of birth and death. The case of Margaret Hayes represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of American medicine, a reminder that the isolation and lack of oversight characterizing frontier life could create opportunities for those who would exploit the vulnerable in the name of scientific progress. It also demonstrates the terrible burden carried by those who discovered such crimes but found themselves powerless to seek justice through conventional means. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Margaret Hayes may not have been unique. The vast, sparsely populated wilderness of early 19th century America provided countless opportunities for those who would prey upon the isolated and defenseless. How many other victims were there scattered across the frontier, their suffering known only to their tormentors, and perhaps a few witnesses who chose silence over the futility of seeking justice? The official records of Margaret Hayes's case remain sealed in the Athens County Courthouse, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in early American medical history. Dr. Hart-well's letter to the State Attorney General was never sent, and the copies of Cunningham's journal that he claimed to have made were never found among his possessions after his death. This mystery reveals the terrifying reality that sometimes the most evil acts are committed by those society trusts most, those who take sacred oaths to do no harm, but who hide behind respectability and professional authority to commit unspeakable crimes. It reminds us that the price of scientific progress should never include the suffering of the innocent, and that those who would pursue knowledge at any cost must be held accountable for their actions. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could there have been other victims whose stories were never told, scattered across the remote settlements of early America? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in medical history. If you appreciated this tale and want more dark mysteries from America's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that expose the hidden horrors of our nation's early years. See you in the next video. In the decades following Margaret's case, Dr. Hart-well became increasingly reclusive and eventually ceased practicing medicine altogether. He sold his remaining medical equipment in 1830 and devoted himself to farming and tending the few animals on his small property. Neighbors described him as a sad but kind man who would provide medical care in emergencies, but who seemed haunted by some unspoken tragedy. The story of Margaret Hayes and Dr. Cunningham's crimes remained buried for nearly 2 centuries. The official records were sealed by court order, and the few people who knew the truth carried their knowledge to their graves. It was only in the 1990s, when Athens County Courthouse records were being digitized, that a researcher discovered the anomalous file containing Dr. Hart-well's sealed report about unusual medical circumstances requiring confidential handling. The discovery prompted a limited investigation that uncovered fragments of the story, enough to assemble the basic facts, but insufficient to provide complete answers about the scope of Cunningham's crimes or the fate of his other victims. Archaeological surveys of the Westfield property and surrounding areas have never located any human remains, suggesting Cunningham was thorough in disposing of evidence. Margaret Hayes lived until 1847, dying peacefully at age 46 in the Quaker household that had cared for her for over 20 years. Her death was recorded simply as natural causes following a long illness, with no mention of the trauma that had shaped her adult life. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Philadelphia, her gravestone bearing only her name and dates of birth and death. The case of Margaret Hayes represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of American medicine, a reminder that the isolation and lack of oversight characterizing frontier life could create opportunities for those who would exploit the vulnerable in the name of scientific progress. It also demonstrates the terrible burden carried by those who discovered such crimes but found themselves powerless to seek justice through conventional means. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that Margaret Hayes may not have been unique. The vast, sparsely populated wilderness of early 19th century America provided countless opportunities for those who would prey upon the isolated and defenseless. How many other victims were there scattered across the frontier, their suffering known only to their tormentors, and perhaps a few witnesses who chose silence over the futility of seeking justice? The official records of Margaret Hayes's case remain sealed in the Athens County Courthouse, accessible only to researchers who can demonstrate legitimate academic interest in early American medical history. Dr. Hart-well's letter to the State Attorney General was never sent, and the copies of Cunningham's journal that he claimed to have made were never found among his possessions after his death. This mystery reveals the terrifying reality that sometimes the most evil acts are committed by those society trusts most, those who take sacred oaths to do no harm, but who hide behind respectability and professional authority to commit unspeakable crimes. It reminds us that the price of scientific progress should never include the suffering of the innocent, and that those who would pursue knowledge at any cost must be held accountable for their actions. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could there have been other victims whose stories were never told, scattered across the remote settlements of early America? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in medical history. If you appreciated this tale and want more dark mysteries from America's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that expose the hidden horrors of our nation's early years. See you in the next video.